can then turn to my book, and they can find a compilation of sources, some of which obviously come from Peters, some of which come from other books, some of which, I mean, when you write a book like this, when you write a brief, what you do is you read a wide variety of books, you find quotes that are relevant, you check to make sure that they're accurate, and then you include them. That's
Professor
what I did.
Dershowitz, let's go to your point that on the issue of civilian casualties, that there are more Israeli civilian casualties.
Am I right about that? Am I right about that?
Let him address the point.
First of all, Mr. Dershowitz, let's look at your argument. The way you try to prove that there are more Israeli civilian casualties or that the numbers aren't accurately juxtaposed.
Right.
Your argument is this. You say that the numbers that are typically put forth, namely 4 times as many Palestinians were killed as Israelis killed, it ranges between 3 and 4 times depending on the moment. You state that those numbers don't include the terrorist attacks which were thwarted.
That's one of the arguments.
And then you go on to say, if we were to include the thousands who would have been killed,
that's one of the arguments.
Then the numbers change.
That's one of the arguments.
Okay, Mr. Dershowitz, let's use your logic.
Yeah.
According to Ma'arif, in the first
Israeli
3 weeks,
newspaper.
Israeli newspaper, in the first 3 weeks of the Second Intifada, Israelis spent 1 million shells. Now, by your argument, Mr. Dershowitz, we should count as a casualty every one of the shells that missed its target.
That's absurd.
That would, I know, it's absurd, like your argument.
Let me answer.
It's absurd, like your argument.
Let me make the difference here. Military, when they come in, they shoot. They shoot up in the air. They shoot for warnings. They shoot not intending to kill.
They just shoot in the air.
Of course, that's part of what you do when you're the military.
Celebrating a wedding.
You shoot in order to frighten. You shoot for a variety of reasons. Now, what we're talking about is the difference between somebody found with a belt entering into Jerusalem or entering into Tel Aviv, who's caught, who tries to detonate the belt, and the belt doesn't go off. That is a thwarted attempt. That's one of my arguments. My second argument is if you count equally, civilian for civilian, the number of Israeli civilians who have been killed far exceeds the number of Palestinian civilians. If you count number for number, the number of women and the number of children, who are often good surrogates for civilianality, you find the numbers are far greater. When you exclude combatants and people who are terrorists from the number of Palestinians killed, the numbers change dramatically. Then I made one other point, and that is Palestinian Authority, whose leader, Yasser Arafat, has $300 million, according to Forbes, in a bank account, hasn't spent much money on first responders to attacks. For example, I document a number of instances where the Israelis have offered to fly by helicopter wounded people that have been wounded and civilians that have been wounded accidentally. The Israelis offer to fly them to the best hospitals in the entire Middle East. And for political reasons, at a particular point in time, the Palestinian Authority has turned down that offer and has caused the death of many of their own civilians as the result of loss of blood by not bringing them quickly enough to hospitals. These are all relevant factors. Now, you can disagree with them, you can argue.
Okay, respond to that point.
Mr. Dershowitz has lots of numbers in his book. What are his sources? Where does he get his numbers from?
The Boston Globe,
leaving aside the numbers he gets for demography, which are lifted whole cloth from Peters, let's look at his human rights sources. Does Mr. Dershowitz use human rights numbers? For his sources on civilian killings, we already know the answer to that question. Because according to Mr. Dershowitz, when the Human Rights Watch documents a man in a wheelchair being deliberately run down by a tank, according to Mr. Dershowitz and presumably his sources, that doesn't count as a civilian death.
Let me respond to that.
No, you have to let me finish.
Okay.
That's Mr. Dershowitz's sources. I looked carefully at his sources. I went through them one by one, very patiently, meticulously, and methodically. Almost all of his sources on these issues are Israeli official websites.
No, that's not
IDF
true.
sources.
That's not true.
Israeli Defense Forces sources.
No, that's just not true.
Yeah, I want to just pause for a moment on his sources. It's true. It's not always IDF.
No,
it's not always
rare.
It's not always official Israeli foreign affairs site. Listen carefully. Remember, this is a distinguished professor, a chair at Harvard Law School.
You said that a few times
yes,
now. It's
I know.
Some jealousy.
Yeah, I'm very envious. I'm very envious of those with your credentials who compose frauds. Mr. Dershowitz, you had an interesting observation. You mentioned that during Black September in 1970, King Hussein killed 4,000 Palestinians, between 3,000 and 4,000. That was an interesting number, and it jibed with what I was familiar with. But I always check sources. That's my little game in life. I turn to the back, listen carefully, so there can be no doubt about it. Listen to his source. This is a scholar. The first source is One Day in September, Sony Pictures, www.sonypictures.com.
It's also a book.
That's page 257, footnote 21.
It's also a book.
A Sony picture.
No, it's a book. Back September is a book. One Day in September is a book.
Sony Pictures. Number two, please listen carefully.
Right.
Some key dates to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I checked that source. I spent some time. I'm not very computer literate, but I spent time tracking it down. You know what the source was? It was a chronology to a high school syllabus.
But,
is that serious?
But nobody disputes the fact that 3,000 to 4,000 people were killed. When you have an undisputed,
is that a serious source?
When you have an
chronology to a high school syllabus.
Let me ask you this question: do you dispute the conclusion that 3,000 to 4,000
we're talking
people
about
were
the
killed?
kinds of sources you
even
put
have
forth.
to cite a source.
A Sony picture. Sony picture.
It's a book.
And a high school curriculum.
One Day in September is an important book that came out.
www.sonypictures.com/classic/one-day. Very serious source.
Because nobody disputes that.
I'm really humbled by that source.
Let me
all my scholarship pales in comparison to that source. Forget about the high school curriculum.
Let me respond to this. We're talking about civilian casualties now. Now, in my civilian casualties, I argue that the number of civilian casualties killed among Israelis is much higher. There's no dispute about that. Selim agrees with that. Human Rights Watch agrees with that. I don't know of a single organization that would disagree with that statistic. And so instead of taking me on the facts of my statistics, what you do is you say that, do you disagree that more Israeli civilians have been killed in the last 3 years than Palestinian?
In the last 3 years,
civilians?
Absolutely.
You do agree?
Absolutely disagree.
You disagree?
Combatants?
I'm talking about the difference between...
The difference in combatants?
No, let me make my point very clear. There have been approximately 2,500 Palestinians and approximately 900 Israeli kills. Nobody disagrees with those figures. My argument, and there's no dispute about that, you don't need Israeli sources, is if you eliminate the number of terrorists, suicide bombers, collaborators, and combatants, and you just focus on, as the Boston Globe did, the number here, I'll read you from the Boston Globe, 18% of the nearly 2,000 Palestinians.
Could you please look at what you said? Who is the Boston Globe quoting?
They are quoting an internal analysis which they have of the IDF, which they have done
internal analysis. I read the book,
which they have done
you're in trouble.
But they have done an independent analysis.
You're quoting the IDF.
And by the way,
is that Selim?
By the way,
is the IDF that Selim?
Selim agrees with this figure.
Really? Can you please find that source?
But Selim agrees that the number of civilian casualties have been lower. Here's my point.
You say they agree with the IDF source.
I agree.
That's pretty scandalous.
The
shockingness of your falsifications is really breathtaking.
Selim often agrees.
You don't want to read your source.
Given by the
I know every word in your book. You don't want to read your source. It's an IDF, an Israeli military source. That's his sources. Which the Boston Globe
and agreed
with. The Boston Globe analyzed the source.
Absolutely.
One lie after another. It's breathtaking.
Read the story.
It's breathtaking.
Read the story, and you will see that the Boston Globe stands behind those figures. Number one, number two. But Selim and Human Rights Watch do not disagree with these figures. There is no reasonable dispute about the fact that more civilians have been killed among the Israeli 900 than